Hi, good afternoon. I'm Robert Clifford from Chicago. I'm lead counsel on the Ethiopian Airlines 302 crash litigation pending in Chicago on behalf of the families. These hearings, both the Senate and House, have been extraordinarily helpful to the families in getting to the real core issues that the litigation will focus on. Certainly the congressional leadership has the subpoena power. They have the weight of the U.S. government behind them in the requests that have been made. Frankly, there are documents that we're seeing today for the first time, yesterday for the first time, that we think should have been produced, some of which maybe have been by Boeing in the litigation. So the litigation itself, in terms of the discovery process, has been lagging behind because we have to defer to the Department of Justice investigation, the NTSB investigation, everything that's going on in Ethiopia and in Jakarta, as well as everything that's taking place here in the House and the Senate. But this information, we've been given great access from both the Senate and the House to this data. We'll use it on behalf of the families. The families have been meeting with Boeing, as you know, yesterday, and actually there was one meeting last week in Chicago with Mr. Bahi Demisi from Ethiopia, who lost his wife, who was one of the flight attendants. That was a private meeting, and all of these meetings have been very helpful to the families, and they've asked that we express appreciation to Boeing for that. So certainly I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the litigation itself. It's pending before Judge Jorge Luis Alonso and Judge David Wiseman in Chicago. The next big hearing date is November 21st in Chicago. In the interim period of time, we're working with Boeing to have them produce literally hundreds of thousands of pages of material to us, all about the not only the design and manufacture of the 737 Max 8, but also the things that transpired between the Lion Air crash in October of 2018 and the Ethiopian crash in March of 2019.
Sorry, you said that some of these hearings are helpful to the families, but we just spoke to one of the families and said that this resembled more of a show, that nothing was getting done.
Well, you know, I can understand that. I'm talking from the litigation perspective, because what happens is a lot of times in litigation, you ask a defendant what time of day it is, and they tell you how to build a watch. And you know, we don't want that. We want to know what time of day it is. So we want to get to the core materials as quickly as we can. And I assure you that the information that's been supplied to Congress, the House and Senate, also to the DOJ, and to the NTSB, is a lot of that core data that we'll get access to at an earlier time and an earlier date than we might otherwise. That's the context in which I say it's helpful. I mean, frankly, the families think that a lot of what's going on here is kind of, you know, congressional rope-a-dope, right? And I get that. But the reality is, from a litigator's perspective, from a trial lawyer's perspective, I'm looking for the hot documents, and you've seen some of them here today and yesterday.
What significant new evidence are you seeing?
Well, the knowledge. You know, you just heard a congressman ask a question, you know, who would think that Boeing in their right mind would ignore or conceal information about a defective product? And frankly, you know, you can go through airplane crash after airplane crash, for me, beginning with the DC-10s that crashed back in 79 and 89, to see that sometimes manufacturers, good people, cut corners because they're assuming that there's no single point of failure. You know, when he said this morning that there wasn't a prior crash, I did the litigation of the DC-10 that crashed in Sioux City, Iowa, and we learned that GE hid information about the defects in their titanium discs from the manufacturer of the aircraft, McDonnell Douglas, and they all assumed that the other one had a safety fail-safe, and they didn't. Those kind of things do happen here. And the idea that this MCAS system and the performance of it was kept from the pilots is an outrageous thing. And you know, early on, I was here in the hearing in May. I recall them blaming the pilots in May. Now they're not blaming the pilots, but they're talking about pilot training. I don't know, maybe is that a play on words? But the reality is there are defects in this system that people knew about and had notice about. And that notice will lead to punitive damage claims being made against Boeing in the litigation in Chicago.
Specifically, in the 4 slides that we were presented, they showed essentially that there were internal discussions within Boeing long before They were
Correct.
not followed through in what we actually were seeing. How significant is it, and how significant is it from the point of view of Boeing constantly saying that they, quote, made mistakes?
Well, look, Boeing will take the view, I'm certain, in the courtroom, that none of what you hear here is legally admissible as an admission of responsibility on the lawsuits. In fact, in the lawsuits, they are denying responsibility. There are answers to all of the complaints, the lawsuit documents. Here, they're talking about the verbiage of responsibility and accountability. That's a lot of PR from my perspective, just like initially when they came out with the $100 million fund on July 3rd, on the eve of our nation's holiday, without any protocols at all for how to give the money away. It was a pivot to change the PR rhetoric of what was taking place at that time. But the documents that we're seeing now, that you've seen in the last 2 days, will be essential to the proofs to show that there were people within the organization who had knowledge of the performance of the MCAS within the normal flight operation envelope, which is what they're talking about, and that the pilots should have been told. And if there's anything that's not taking place here that we're a little surprised about, is that there's not a lot of focus being placed on the placement of these engines. And when you talk about revealing the existence of the MCAS system, well, that made a material difference in whether you do or you don't have to have pilots go through simulation training. And that, you heard the dollar amount today. If we have to retrain your pilots and simulators because of this, we'll give you $1 million rebate. Well, that's an amazing statistic if you think about it. This was all designed to get this airplane in the skies ahead of their competition with Airbus. Just look at what's happening in China now. In China, Boeing holds a 47, 43% lead in the marketplace. And the China market is going to explode in the next several years. You heard the testimony about that today. Well, that's what is a big concern to Boeing. Now, is that putting dollars before safety? Some would argue that it does. But all good people, they don't wake up in the morning intending to commit a harm. Doctors don't wake up in the morning intending to commit medical negligence, but we all wake up in the morning with the capacity to run a red light, and sometimes we do. And here, they didn't run a red light, they ran a yellow light, and then the red light, and they shouldn't have done that.
Okay, this is Robert A. Clifford. Clifford Law Offices in Chicago. He's founder and